Immediately stakes claim in the center, preparing for rapid development and controlling key squares. Establishing central symmetry, this symmetrical response immediately contests key squares and opens avenues for rapid development. Instantly challenging the central pawn, this knight's advance initiates a dynamic struggle for control of the board's core. Developing a knight to its natural square, this move defends the pawn and prepares for further piece activity. This position immediately sets up a tactical skirmish, directly challenging the defender's pawn structure and forcing early decisions about piece placement. Challenging the bishop's influence, black boldly questions white's early development, forcing a decision and potentially gaining space on the queen side. Retreating the bishop preserves its diagonal influence, keeping the knight on c6 under pressure while preparing for future pawn advances and central control. Developing a knight here directly challenges the center and prepares for castling, increasing piece harmony. Securing the king paves the way for central piece development and potential kingside expansion, a pragmatic approach. Developing the bishop harmoniously prepares for castling and reinforces control over the central squares. Shifting the rook to the central file prepares to contest the open d-file and supports a potential d4 pawn advance, aiming to pry open black's position. Gaining space on the queen side is a clear intention, but this pawn thrust opens up the c-file for white's rook should it ever decide to venture there, and it also offers a potential outpost for a white knight on c6 later. Retreating the bishop to b3 preserves its diagonal scope, while anticipating a potential pawn advance on the queen side, aiming to keep the center flexible and ready for future pawn pushes or piece deployments. Solidifying the pawn structure and opening a diagonal for the bishop is a sensible response, preparing to contest the center and potentially challenge white's queenside development. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing for a potential d4 advance, this move sacrifices some immediate central activity for long-term positional stability and prepares to bring the d-pawn into play. Safeguarding the monarch by tucking him away behind pawns is a prudent choice, solidifying the kingside against any premature pawn storms or knightly incursions that white might orchestrate. Securing the kingside space, this maneuver subtly aims to prevent black's knight from swinging over to g4, a recurring annoyance in these Ruy-Lopez structures, while also preparing a potential kingside pawn storm down the h-file. A developing piece, neatly tucked behind its pawn structure, now aims to bolster the center and prepare for potential queenside expansion. White decisively challenges the center, aiming to break open lines and activate the bishop on c1. Reasserting control over the central d-file after white's pawn push is a sound defensive measure, aiming to reinforce the e5 pawn and prepare for potential pawn breaks or defensive maneuvers. This often leads to a more solid pawn structure for black and discourages white's immediate aggressive intentions. Preparing a flexible pawn structure, this knight now eyes the kingside for potential action or to support a central advance, while also keeping an eye on the d4 pawn. Reclaiming diagonal influence is the immediate aim, redirecting the bishop to a more active square where it can eye the kingside and potentially support a future e4 push, all while avoiding the immediate pressure on its current position. Undermining black's queenside pawn structure is the immediate goal, aiming to exploit the diagonal created by the bishop pair. This audacious pawn thrust immediately challenges black's queenside expansion. White is forcing the issue, not content to passively develop. By advancing the pawn, white seeks to open lines for their own pieces, particularly the rook on the file, while simultaneously creating weaknesses in black's pawn chain. Consider the potential fallout. If black captures, white's b-pawn becomes advanced and a target. If black ignores it, white gains valuable space and can potentially exploit the weakened squares. This move signals a shift from maneuvering to active confrontation, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious setup. Black's queen embarks on a journey, aiming to connect the rooks and potentially pressure the d4 pawn, while also keeping an eye on the kingside for any immediate threats. Shattering the queenside pawn chain, white opens lines for potential pressure against black's castled king by removing the immediate pawn shield and creating an open file. Opening the file invites a dynamic struggle for that crucial open column. The rook's aggressive march across the board to a8 immediately challenges the isolated b-pawn, forcing black to consider its defense, while simultaneously opening a crucial file for white's remaining rook and potentially creating weaknesses around black's monarch should the defensive structure falter. Reclaiming the bishop solidifies black's queenside pawn structure and repositions the piece to a potentially more active diagonal, creating a subtle shift in the game's equilibrium. Seizing control of the central expanse and forcing a reaction from black, this bold advance aggressively stakes a claim in the heart of the board. Reclaiming the central square after the pawn exchange, this knight repositions for a more active role, eyeing the kingside and potentially supporting a future c5 break. Rerouting the knight towards the kingside, aiming to bolster the pawn chain and potentially create attacking chances on that flank. The knight's relocation to the queenside begins a potential maneuver to challenge white's central control and exploit the open file. Initiating pressure on the f6 knight forces a reevaluation of black's defensive setup, potentially disrupting its harmonious pawn structure and piece placement. Reclaiming the initiative, black gently repositions the bishop, preparing to contest the now more open central files and potentially shore up the kingside after white's rather aggressive pawn push. Repositioning the knight to g3 aims to enhance its defensive capabilities on the kingside and potentially prepare a knight hop to f5, creating attacking pressure against black's king should the opportunity arise. This subtle maneuver also frees up the f3 square for potential future piece transfers or defensive reinforcement. The g6 advance aims to shore up the kingside's pawn structure and prepare for bg7, creating a formidable fianchettoed bishop that can exert pressure along the long diagonal, potentially targeting white's queenside. Unlocking the queenside's potential hinges on this repositioning, aiming to redeploy the queen to a more active square where it can support a pawn storm or join an assault on the kingside. Reasserting presence on the light squares, the bishop subtly prepares to challenge white's control of the long diagonal, a necessary counterpoint to the knight's recent repositioning. Reclaiming the open file offers immediate pressure, eyeing the pawn on a6 and potentially reinforcing the kingside if needed later. Black's rook, having shuffled back and forth, now claims the only open file, a crucial step toward contesting white's central control. Shifting the bishop to c2 reassesses the influence on the queenside and prepares for a potential regrouping, aiming to centralize the piece and perhaps support future pawn advances. Unleashing pressure along the c-file, this advance signals a decisive shift in intent, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay, potentially opening lines for the queen and bishop. Shattering the pawn chain opens the critical d-file, offering a direct pathway for your rook to become a potent attacking force. Embracing the open c-file and consolidating the bishop's position are the immediate priorities after this recapture. Redirecting attacking pressure towards the queenside, this redeployment of the rook offers a fresh perspective on controlling the d-file and potentially disrupting black's queen and bishop alignment. Asserting control over the crucial d-file is the immediate priority, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for potential central pawn breaks that could liberate black's pieces, while simultaneously discouraging any immediate kingside expansion by white. Shifting the queen to target that vulnerable c6 square, while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn chain and preparing potential advances on the queenside, showcases a dynamic repositioning aiming to disrupt black's compact setup. Reestablishing pressure on the queenside and preparing to challenge the open, a file seems to be the immediate goal with this repositioning. Initiating a strategic redeployment, the bishop retreats to safety, preparing to anchor defensive lines and potentially re-enter the fray on the kingside, a subtle shift in focus. Steering the knight towards the queenside, a subtle repositioning that seeks to contest the now semi-open c-file and potentially support a pawn push on the b-file if the opportunity arises, aiming to alleviate the pressure black has been under. Suddenly, the knight on g3 leaps forward, aiming to pierce the queenside defenses and exploit the slight overextension created by black's earlier pawn push. This audacious deployment disrupts black's comfortable development and introduces immediate tactical possibilities, potentially forcing a pawn sacrifice for open lines or a positional retreat. Instigating a central pawn push to disrupt white's knight outpost on f5, this maneuver simultaneously prepares to redeploy the knight to a more active square, aiming to contest the crucial d5 pawn and potentially challenge the open d-file. Sacrificing the knight, white aims to simplify the position and exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king, forcing a liquidation that could favor white's more active pieces and central pawn majority. The exchange of queens is imminent, and black has chosen to recapture with the queen, a decision that solidifies white's knight outpost on f5 for the moment, but avoids further material loss while keeping flexible attacking options. Unveiling the knight's potential, this repositioning aims to exploit the compromised kingside defense and create immediate threats against black's beleaguered monarch. The knight hops into the central fray, creating a dynamic pawn structure and challenging white's bishop on c2, a subtle but important positional shift that could unlock attacking chances on the queenside by preparing to contest the open a-file or even infiltrate on the c-file if the pawn structure opens further. Provoking piece redistribution, this maneuver creates dynamic imbalances and pressures black's queenside structure while potentially opening lines for white's rook on the a-file. This maneuver attempts to regain some central presence and challenge white's piece coordination, but it might overextend the knight, exposing it to potential tactical skirmishes and making it difficult to support the queenside. Averting a potentially awkward pin along the file, the bishop retreats to a more secure square, preparing to support potential advances on the queenside and maintain a watchful eye on the central tension. Seeking a more secure perch, the bishop retreats to a square where it can potentially reinforce the kingside and monitor white's advancing pawns, while maintaining a watchful eye on the central tension. Preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially reroute the rook to a more active post, white aims to improve coordination and challenge black's currently passive piece placement. The rook now galvanizes the c-file, preparing to engage white's defenses and potentially destabilize the otherwise solid central pawn structure. The rook's relocation to the c-file aims to support a potential pawn push or to contest the open file, but it might be slightly premature given black's robust pawn structure and the fact that white's pieces aren't perfectly coordinated for an immediate assault. Consider how black's pieces are currently defensively positioned, especially the knight on c5, which is well supported. There's an opportunity here to regroup and improve piece placement before committing to aggressive action. Perhaps a move that tightens white's own center or activates the other rook would be more beneficial at this juncture, preventing black from solidifying their position further. Challenging white's central control, black aims to activate the knight, potentially eyeing squares like c5 to disrupt white's pieces, or even preparing to maneuver it to a more active role on the kingside if white's king remains exposed. Pivoting the knight to f3 now clears the king's defense from the g5 bishop's previous attack and reestablishes a more robust kingside pawn structure, while also preparing for potential pawn pushes on the kingside later in the game. The knight embarks on a journey to the queenside, aiming to displace the opposing knight from its dominant outpost and potentially prepare for pawn advances on that wing. Unlocking the pressure on the kingside with the knight's repositioning, white aims to bypass black's defensive wall. The tension around the d-file intensifies, and bringing the queen to c7 is a strategic pivot, subtly preparing to contest that vital vertical expanse and potentially repositioning for a future attack on white's queenside if the opportunity arises. Initiating knight repositioning toward the kingside aims to bolster attacking potential against black's seemingly solid structure. Seeking a more secure haven, the black king steps away from the newly opened diagonal, a necessary precaution as the queens remain on the board and potential threats still linger. Opening a new diagonal for the queen and challenging the central control is the aim here, as white seeks to unravel black's cramped position and create dynamic play. Opening a file for the queen on the kingside often signifies an intent to involve her in the attack or to create an escape route. Here the pawn push offers a dynamic response to white's aggressive pawn advance, aiming to disrupt white's control of the center and potentially create counterplay along the newly opened h-file. Executing this pawn capture dramatically alters the board's geometry, creating an open c-file that, while offering white increased influence, simultaneously exposes white's own king to potential threats from black's centralized pieces, forcing a reevaluation of defensive strategies and piece placement. Reclaiming the central square is paramount after the pawn exchange, aiming to contest the now open d-file and prepare for potential piece maneuvering to the kingside. A subtle maneuver, this queen repositioning prepares to exert pressure along the light squares and potentially support a kingside advance, forcing black to decide how to defend against the encroaching influence. Seizing the open file with the rook might seem tempting, but it sacrifices the bishop's important defensive influence, leaving your king exposed to potential future threats from white's advanced knights. Pivoting the bishop to the diagonal transforms the piece into a potent attacker, now eyeing the critical dark squares around black's king, a silent threat accumulating pressure. Protecting the king by stepping sideways, this maneuver aims to untangle black's potentially cramped pieces and offers a subtle improvement in king's safety, clearing the g8 square for potential future pawn advances on the kingside or simply for better breathing room. Bolstering the bishop's influence on the queenside, this repositioning aims to prevent black from consolidating their advanced knight and potential queenside expansion. Snapping up the offered pawn might seem tempting, but it ignores the developing initiative and the precariousness of white's kingside structure. Aggressively contesting the queenside with queen and knight now aims to exploit black's somewhat passive placement,